I'm delighted to welcome you all to this event where we will be sharing our research findings around the experiences of children with special educational needs and disabilities, SEND, as I'll refer to during this session. This is about their experiences within the youth justice system. Today we'll also be holding a Q&A session. I'll come to the running order in a section and introducing our wonderful set of speakers. But first, who are the Centre for Justice Innovation? The Centre for Justice Innovation is a charity which seeks to build a justice system which everyone believes is fair and effective. We believe that the justice system should be focused on solving the issues that drive crime and social harm, that it should be fair in how it treats people, that it should be proportionate in the things it does, and that those on the front line should be given the freedom and support to come up with innovative solutions to the problems that their communities actually face. To deliver our vision of a fairer and more effective justice system, we provide three things. We provide hands-on support to practitioners in the justice system to help them develop and share effective and innovative practice. We conduct research into how things work right now and how they could potentially work better. And we promote evidence-based and innovative justice policy reforms. Now, today's research that we're going to discuss forms part of the Centre's work to promote evidence and best practice surrounding pre-court disposals in the youth justice system, and in particular to promote the use of diversion for children. Given the high prevalence of children with SEND within the youth justice system, our recommendations published in our report today draw out specific and practical changes that should be implemented to recognise this and adapt the processes to account for this. The discussions aim to engage relevant stakeholders who could help facilitate change at a practice level, but also a policy level. Our launch event today will also be followed by a practice-specific workshop event in April, which we'll share the links to in our chat. So, first, let me introduce you to our speakers. First up, we will have Carla McDonald-Heffernan. Carla is a research officer at the Centre for Justice Innovation. I'm not going to make Carla wave. You're going to hear from Carla very shortly in a second. Then we have Bami Jalaso. Bami is a practice officer for the Centre for Justice Innovation. And we have Kate Langley, who has joined us from the Youth Justice Board, who will be speaking later. And we also have Paul Stride, who is joining us from the National Police Chiefs Council. So first off, I'm going to hand over to Carla, and Carla is going to speak through the report for the next 20 minutes. So Carla, if I can ask you to try and finish your input within 20 minutes before I give you that yellow prod. Is that okay?
So thank you so much, Sal, for those introductions, and hopefully my screen is sharing okay now. So I'm just going to talk through first a bit of context about why we chose to do this piece of research and some highlights from our findings. I'm going to keep it relatively brief, but if anyone's interested in reading more, our report should have just been published on our website, so you can go and read more specifically about the findings and our recommendations there. Just to double check, has my slide changed just now for everyone? Great, sorry, just for make sure the technology is working. So like Sam mentioned, this piece of research was centered around how well youth diversion is working for children with special educational needs and disabilities. So I'm sure most people are very familiar with what diversion is, but just to kind of quickly give a definition before we go into it. So youth diversion is a very well-established practice now across England and Wales, with most YJSs having some form of diversion as an option for children coming through the justice system. It's an alternative to a formal outcome, so it means rather than going to court or getting a formal out-of-court disposal, children don't receive a criminal record and would instead be put on a voluntary intervention which provides support and is usually a very light touch intervention run by the YJS. So given that evidence has shown most young people grow out of offending and don't go on to offend past their youth. And that contact with the criminal justice system actually increases likelihood of reoffending. Youth diversion has become a very accepted practice because it's fulfilling the stated main aim of the justice system, as kind of mentioned in the Crime and Disorder Act of 1998. They're saying that the primary aim of the justice system should be to prevent offending by children and young people, and also avoiding the knock-on harms of things such as criminal records and going through the more formal processing in the criminal justice system. So why have we chosen to focus on SEND? I'm sure, again, many of you are aware, but more recent data has come out around the prevalence of SEND in the youth justice system, with data estimating that roughly 70 to 90% of children in the youth justice system have been diagnosed with some form of SEND, and more recent government data coming out around a specific group of 14 to 16-year-olds showing that 80% of children cautioned and sentenced had some level of diagnosed SEND. So this kind of high prevalence of SEND within the youth justice system alone is kind of reason enough to focus on this for research. But what also played into this for us was around the particular importance of diversion to children with SEND for several different reasons. So first of all, given how evidence shows that the level of communication and understanding required to navigate through the justice system is extremely high, those with additional difficulties with communication and understanding sort of face greater challenges in navigating through the criminal justice system. So whether this is in police interviews, in interactions with practitioners, in kind of experience at court, children with SEND often will have their behavior and their way of communicating misinterpreted by practitioners. So things like poor eye contact, things like monosyllabic answers or poorly elaborated responses have been shown to be taken by practitioners as confirmatory bias around a child being non-compliant or being particularly difficult, rather than recognizing that as a potential effect of a child's difficulty with communication or of their SEND. So secondly, as I quickly touched upon, formal processing in the criminal justice system comes with its negative effects and knock-on harms, but for children with SEND, these often enhance and compound challenges that they already face. So, for example, the knock-on effects of a criminal record will compound the challenges that children with SEND will already have in joining the workforce or in accessing employment. Things like the effects of absence from education will also compound children with SEND experiences or the vital support they rely on through education, whether this is through educational health and care plans or other forms of support that they receive from education for their SEND. Also, absences because of criminal justice involvement have been shown to be related to kind of schools using that as a reason to exclude children, and children with SEND already face an extremely high rate of school exclusions. So again, just enhancing a kind of challenge that they already face. Lastly, so some more recent evidence and reports suggest that children with SEND are likely to already have interacting characteristics that put them at higher risk of being in the criminal justice system already. So one recent study found that children in receipt of school meals, children living in high deprived areas, and children from certain minoritized ethnic groups were more likely to have autism. So putting them at greater risk, factors that are already putting them at greater risk of coming into contact with the criminal justice system are again compounded by that intersectional disadvantage. So just before moving on to talking about the research, I just quickly wanted to make a quick point about our use of terminology and explain quickly why we chose to use the term SEND, despite being aware and acknowledging its limitations. So particularly as a deficit-focused term, which implicitly places onus on the individual rather than structural factors that disadvantage them. The term SEND doesn't fully account for the social theory of disability that recognizes that disability arises from a relationship between a person and their environment. And terms such as neurodivergent or additional learning needs may be less stigmatizing in that regard, or kind of the term underserved. However, we chose SEND firstly because this is the term around which conversations and data are usually structured in the educational system, which is a key partner of the YJS, and around which, that kind of conversation is structured. And because this piece of research came as a response to the government's green paper, Send Support, Right Place, Right Time, and grew from there. Secondly, SEND is obviously a very broad category that encompasses a variety of different needs, and we've kind of endeavored in our research to be more specific where we can, but just to kind of quickly recap, those needs fall into 4 broad areas that relate to communication and interaction, cognition and learning, and emotional mental health, and sensory or physical needs. So again, I'm just going to briefly touch on the research methodology used in the research. But if you want to know any more detail about this, you can, of course, consult the report. But we had a 3-pronged approach to gathering data, which involved practitioner surveys, practitioner interviews, and children interviews. So our practitioner surveys was open to any practitioners working in the youth justice sector, and was kind of disseminated through our networks. And we received 43 responses to that. And it was kind of open questions where people were able to give responses. Our practitioner interviews were remote, sort of half an hour to an hour long interviews with practitioners, of which we interviewed 22. So that included diversion caseworkers, specialists, YJS workers, YJS police workers, and defense directors to get a range of perspectives. And lastly, our children interviews, these were face-to-face with children ranging from the age of 13 to 18 with different types of SEND, and those were face-to-face interviews lasting 20 minutes to an hour, depending on what the child was comfortable with. And our research questions kind of centered around the access of youth diversion schemes to children with SEND and their ability to engage in these diversion schemes based on the kind of adaptability of interventions. And we're specifically focused around what changes to practice could improve these things. So moving on to our findings, one of the first things we came across was a great variation in YJS's abilities to screen for SEND in children they came across. So alongside the kind of high prevalence of SEND in the justice system, there's also quite a high prevalence of undiagnosed SEND. And yeah, across the YJSs we spoke to, we found that there was quite a big variation in YJS's ability to diagnose and screen for SEND for children who came through their service. And this was primarily dependent on whether a YJS had co-located speech and language therapists or not, as those who did have co-located speech and language therapists were able to routinely screen kind of the majority or all children who came through their service and provide them with a prompt diagnosis, whereas those who didn't have that co-located specialist on team had to resort to sort of community wait times, which I'm sure many of you know can take up to several years, as illustrated in the quote on the top left. And so not only did this mean that SEND couldn't be considered in diversion decision-making as a mitigating factor to bring context to a child's kind of wider life or potentially more understanding to why they've committed an offence, but it also meant that a child could get that support from that point onwards in place in their lives, which would likely reduce future instances of offending and reduce their future contact with the criminal justice system. So secondly, one of the main points that came out of our conversations with children in particular, as well as from practitioners, was the sort of harmful effect of their interaction with police. So the first point of contact for children coming into the criminal justice system is usually police. And yet a lot of police practice continues to go against child first principles and be unadapted to children in general, but more specifically harmful to children with SEND. So an example of this was several children describing to us their experiences of arrest, and several of them talking about kind of quite a high level of use of force upon arrest. So as the quote at the top left illustrates, sort of being dragged out of the house or being picked up by police, and the use of restraints as well, so use of handcuffs. And this was particularly detrimental to children who had diagnosed or undiagnosed autism or ASD, who often struggled and had specific sensory needs who tended to be sort of overstimulated or kind of have particularly harmful experiences with that element of sort of being physically handled. Secondly, a lot of children reported not understanding much of what the police was saying to them, a lot of use of jargon, a lot of use of complex terms. And given that understanding is kind of the first key pillar in procedural fairness, this lack of understanding that children had coming into the criminal justice system not only lowered their trust in the police, as kind of illustrated in the top quote in the middle, where a child kind of implied that police were using this language intentionally so that they wouldn't be able to understand what they were saying. But it kind of would then move on to lowering their trust in the criminal justice system as a whole because of this. And so related to both of these things, we found that there was a lack of training for police around specifically youth justice, but also around SEND, which led to quite a skeptical culture among police around sort of context and understanding of children who had reported to them that they had SEND. So like the quote at the bottom right illustrates, sort of implying that, again, like evidence shows, this confirmatory bias of perceiving behavior from children as being intentional when it might be resulting from this end. So again, this is very linked to a lack of training and a lack of kind of resources available to police to understand the wider context of a child's behavior. So we also found issues within the diversion decision-making process itself. So firstly, related to police, but more specifically around the criteria of diversion decision-making, we found quite a lot of inconsistencies in the application of the criteria of admission of guilt and acceptance of responsibility. So without going into too much detail, the different pathways into diversion, including outcome 22 and community resolutions, either require, in the case of a community resolution, an acceptance of responsibility, or have no requirement for either of those criteria for an outcome 22. Yet police often assumed that a full admission of guilt was required for a child to access diversion. And again, there wasn't much guidance around the nuances between what a full admission was versus an acceptance of responsibility, or what could be accepted in terms of communication from a child. There was also the assumption by police officers that remorse should play a part in diversion decision-making, although this isn't a requirement in any sort of guidance, not in the child gravity matrix or any diversion decision requirement. And again, both of these things, sort of showing remorse and being able to kind of articulate an admission of guilt, was particularly difficult for children with SEND, given the communication needs, but also the sort of additional emotional processing needs and the difference in how children might be expressive of remorse or may kind of process remorse. Secondly, we found quite a lot of inconsistencies in the joint decision-making panels. So although all the YJSs we spoke to did have a formal joint decision-making panel process, there were discrepancies around where the decision would ultimately lie if a consensus wasn't reached in the panel, or how much discretion police would have over the joint decision-making panel. So like you can see in these two contrasting quotes on the right, in the top one, it's clear that in this YJS, the police had quite a lot of discretion to override the decision made in the joint decision-making panel, and that it would ultimately come down to the police to be able to make that decision, whereas the one on the bottom is more a multilateral approach to making that decision. And again, there were inconsistencies in the agencies that were able to be at the panel, so whether education and social care were present or not, which would again affect that conversation and the different cultural differences between different perspectives and agencies. So linked to the kind of admission of guilt and acceptance of responsibility criteria were the shortcomings of legal support. So because solicitors were often not trained in youth justice or equipped to deal with children with SEND, they often didn't necessarily have the correct knowledge around criteria for accessing diversion or around how police were implementing that criteria. And a lot of solicitors were advising children to give no comment interviews at the police station. And where this wasn't accompanied with a pre-prepared statement by the solicitor written with the child accepting responsibility, or a letter written beforehand, this would mean that a child was sent straight to court rather than having the option of being offered a diversion. And although some of these referrals from court would then be sent back and referred to a diversion, this still put the child through the sort of traumatic process of going to court, and in many cases often led to a formal outcome rather than a diversionary outcome. Again, we found some instances of children not being offered legal support at all, as illustrated in the top right quote, and it kind of reinforced the point of the sort of understanding barriers that children with SEND might have, or their difficulty with understanding the implications of making a certain decision. So the inadequacies of the current system in ensuring that all children are getting legal support, or if they are refusing legal support, doing that only once they have a full understanding of the consequences and of what legal support could provide for them. And so lastly, to touch on YJS interventions themselves, so we found a lot of positive practice in YJS. So again, this is of course not comparable to sort of police practice around SEND, because YJS staff are obviously much more trained in dealing with children and have a lot more expertise and experience in handling and understanding children. But we found a lot of positive practice in YJS interventions, sort of adaptability and flexibility in being able to carry out sessions in a way that would be most useful to a child. So in terms of length of the sessions, a lot of practitioners were able to sort of shorten a session according to how long a child, and specifically a child with SEND, might be able to concentrate for, so making that more frequent sessions of half an hour instead of an hour and a half, for example. And there was also a lot of flexibility in terms of the locations of sessions and the style of intervention carried out. So instead of relying on a workbook and relying on a kind of sat down written task with a child, some diversion practitioners were able to be a lot more creative and take a child to the park, for example, having them draw down all the antisocial behavior they could see in the park, while also kind of getting out the extra energy they had and learning in a way that was more adaptable to them. We also had instances of practitioners using audio recording rather than kind of written workbook, where that wasn't the style of learning that was really going to engage the child, or using kind of more creative approaches like making a poster, again, rather than writing. And secondly, in these instances of positive practice, we also found that practitioners were really involving children and families' voices in molding what that intervention was going to look like. Where practice was less good, we found that interventions were less kind of adapted and tailored to the learning styles of the child, and could rely instead on just a standard workbook based on the offence that a child had been brought in for. So one practitioner describing sort of whenever a child was kind of brought in for theft, that they would have to go through a specific workbook around theft and its consequences that wasn't necessarily very engaging to a child. Overarchingly, the issues we found in YJS interventions was that this positive practice was not being shared and standardized enough, both internally within YJSs. There wasn't a sort of standard approach of being able to create that adaptability and flexibility, but also across YJSs. Things were being shared in terms of the approaches that were beneficial. And lastly, just in terms of resources, things like written resources were also key to kind of keep in mind when talking about children with SEND. So in some instances, we found that children of a certain age were being handed a standard leaflet, disregarding their ability to actually kind of read and understand that leaflet. And also things like dates for appointments being written in numerical shorthand rather than written out longer, meant some children were missing appointments because they couldn't understand that form of writing a date. So lastly, just to conclude, our main takeaway from the report was that the youth justice system is not working well for children with SEND. And given they make up the vast majority of children in the system, we can say the youth justice system is not currently working for children. And so related to this, just the key pillars of procedural fairness aren't being met for them currently. So understanding, when that comes from their interaction with police, perception that they're being treated with neutrality, again, linked to the understanding, and children being given a fair chance at having a voice in the process when their voice is being misinterpreted or the behavior misconstrued as a child being difficult rather than understanding the context of their needs. This doesn't give them a proper voice. So a lot has come out of the research, and we have many more sort of detailed, specific recommendations in our report. But just the key messages that have kind of stuck out to me that I will just conclude with here is that we need to build in the assumption that children have SEND into all parts of the system. And linked to this, we need to increase training and guidance around SEND, specifically for the police, for the benefit of all children, and specifically to kind of legal support as well. We need to have a specialised YJS role that is protected for the police, so police YJS role in which they can get kind of more specific training around SEND. And lastly, we need to ensure early identification of SEND. Children need to have any undiagnosed SEND picked up on at that early point so they can have the support put in place to reduce their likelihood of coming back into the justice system. And we need to bring education in as a key partner in this process so we can ensure that support continues beyond their involvement with the youth justice system. I think I've gone a tiny bit over time, so I'll just pass back to Sal here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Carla. Some stark statistics in there, and that was just obviously an overview of the report. I'd obviously encourage everybody to kind of dig deep into the report. There's a lot of interesting insight there. There's a lot of really kind of profound recommendations to highlight this issue of SEND and importantly, what we can do about it. And now I'm going to invite our next speaker on. This is Kate Langley. Kate will be offering her thoughts on behalf of the Youth Justice Board. Kate, I'll hand over to you for the next 10 minutes.
Lovely. Thank you. I hope you can all hear me. Sorry, I always say this, but it's technical issues again today. Yeah. So hopefully I stay with you for this. Yeah, so thanks for inviting me to speak today. Really welcome this report and the work that have been done by the Centre for Justice Innovation. And certainly from a YJB perspective, you know, we are very clear that children with SEND are overrepresented in the youth justice system in England and Wales, but also I think, as Carla touched on, face additional individual, familial and societal barriers in education and youth justice settings. You know, in fact, you know, the neurodivergent conditions are so common in the youth justice cohort that some academics have actually argued that they shouldn't be in the justice system at all, and you know, but recognizing it is becoming the norm. So we really support the need for screening for children with SEND at the earliest opportunity, and diverting them away from the formal system wherever possible. So you know, this kind of, you know, this report is really helpful in terms of that. For us, you know, there is a need for system change to ensure that all aspects of the youth justice system and practices based in individualised, strength-based, trauma-informed, child-first approaches. So we know that applying these approaches effectively should create better environments for children with SEND who do enter the system, especially when combined with adaptation to ways of working and the introduction of quality training, which has been touched on today, and appropriate tools and guidance on how to identify and work with children with SEND in a strengths-based way. This would really, if we were to work in this way, we think that we could, you know, together prevent offending and also ensure that children are not further criminalised or traumatised by the youth justice system, and that they can be supported to build on their strengths and go on to make positive contributions to society. We believe that a lack of clinical diagnosis should also not be a barrier to appropriate support. So if a child is presenting with challenges and neurodivergence is suspected, then the appropriate support should be put in place as soon as possible, rather than delaying support until a diagnosis is received. So, you know, we've touched on this, but the current evidence is showing that children with SEND require a strength-based, individualised response from both education and youth justice, and that this aligns directly with the YJB's guiding principle and the child first evidence base, which also promotes a childhood outside of the justice system. So some of the emerging practice that suggest key improvements to better support children with SEND. So some of this has been touched on, but the early screening of children at potential trigger points. So for example, when a child is at risk of exclusion, as well as screening a child when they come into contact with the youth justice system. The inclusion of specialists within multi-agency youth justice teams to conduct screening helps to identify alternative pathways to work with children with SEND. Ensuring a child is viewed firstly as an individual with their own specific strengths and needs, and the importance of engaging with family members or other support networks of the child. This has been talked about a lot and has come out in the research, but the importance of adequate and high quality training relating to SEND, which includes an understanding of co-occurrence that may be present and the intertwined relationship with childhood adversity and trauma, and obviously practical tools to support each child, including communication styles and behaviour management. I think Carla already touched on some of the barriers. You know, we've talked about these children facing additional barriers, so many of them will have unmet needs when they come into contact with the criminal justice system. So lack of identification of their needs, delays in assessments, lack of appropriate support or interventions once diagnosed. Often they've got increased vulnerability due to violence and abuse, poorer mental health, an increased risk of substance misuse, societal stigma and labelling, increased likelihood of exclusion from education, and higher unemployment rates. So all of these factors dramatically increase the likelihood that a child will go on to offend. So it's therefore essential that we diagnose conditions at the earliest possible stage and work positively with children to meet their needs and consequently reduce the likelihood of offending. And we know that failure to do so can have a profound effect on an individual's outcomes. So what are some of the things that the YJB have been doing? So in January of this year, we published the out of court disposal section of the case management guidance. So this incorporates recently revised documents such as the Child Gravity Matrix, Community Resolution Guidance, and Outcome 22 guidance, and it brings all of these together in one place to provide practical guidance on the effective delivery of out of court disposal. There's a real focus on diversion, so it encompasses the full range of out of court disposals available, including non-statutory disposals, and really recognising that contact with the justice system is in itself a criminogenic factor. It recognises that professional judgment is required to inform decision making for children, and that out of court disposal schemes shouldn't operate a blanket policy, but rather consider each child on a case by case basis, exercising professional discretion. It provides clarity on the full range of out of court disposals available for use with children and what is required from professionals and others in their effective use. It provides clarity on the distinction between admission of guilt and acceptance of responsibility. It standardises the process of joint decision making and provides clear guidance around what these panels should look like and who should attend them. So it does state that as a minimum, the panel should include a representative from the Police Youth Justice Service and a representative from social care and education. And we know from our close working with HMI probation colleagues, this would also be their expectation. I won't steal any of Paul's thunder because I know we've got Paul from MPCC on the phone, and we've worked really closely with MPCC around developing their guidance documents. So in terms of the work that went into the Child Gravity Matrix, you know, this identifies SEND as a mitigating factor which should be taken into consideration when deciding the most appropriate outcome for children who offend. And the requirement for remorse is not an aggregating factor in the Child Gravity Matrix. So I think some of the questions for me are, you know, how well is guidance being used, the out of court disposal, case management guidance, and some of the documents that have been developed, you know, in close working with our policing colleagues. We've also introduced a prevention and diversion assessment tool that will come into effect from April, and this will be a universal assessment tool to ensure a consistent approach to assessment for all children and provide us with information about their profiles and needs. So that's a really important development. The YJB's oversight framework also supports the identification of sharing of practice across the youth justice system. So this is still embedding and evolving, but the identification of practice is a real focus for us at the moment, and we are currently revamping our Youth Justice Resource Hub to make these examples of practice more accessible. So really welcome this report and this research. You know, we know that children in the youth justice system have multiple complex needs, including SEND. I think rather than focusing on specific issues, the focus should be on developing services that recognise children with multiple complex needs. The prevalence of complex unmet need also highlights the importance of early identification and intervention. So problems identified in the criminal justice system are often the symptom of upstream issues. So we could pose the question, rather than asking how criminal justice can adapt to SEND, should the question be what needs to happen to ensure children with SEND get the right support to prevent them from disproportionately coming into the youth justice system in the first place? I have to sort of leave it on that note, really. So I think it really is about doing everything we can as a system to prevent these children coming into contact with the criminal justice system, but when they do, being able to respond appropriately to their needs. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kate, and thank you for battling through your technical problems to deliver those thoughts on behalf of the Youth Justice Board. Next, I'm going to invite Paul Stride to speak on behalf of the National Police Chiefs Council. Paul, can I hand over to you?
Thank you, Sal, and thank you for the opportunity and invitation to come and speak today. When I first heard about this work being done in producing the report, I was really excited. That was in an informal meeting with Carla, Bami and Claire from the Centre for Justice Innovation, because I recognise there's a real opportunity here for the report to influence what we do with child-centred policing. The timing it's the stars have aligned well, shall we say, to be able to make that impact. My background in policing is one which has lent itself to working with children and young people. Having previously worked in a number of schools roles and as a youth offending team officer, this is a subject which is close to my heart. Having seen that prevalence of neurodivergence and SEND within, both in the school environment and in youth justice, I feel doing the role I perform now as the coordinator for the children and young persons portfolio, there's an opportunity to really try and make some positive changes in this regard. I can, as you would expect, a lot of what I'm hearing in Carla's presentation chimes with my experience, and some of it is hard listening for policing, but we will take an open approach and go through each point in turn and see how it can influence what we do. We've been doing some work on our portfolio strategy to try and simplify what we do, and we've developed some themes, some strategic themes, which will help align our work better. Forgive me, technical issue myself there. So we have come up with the strategic themes of your trust, your voice, and your future, which is to arrange the work of the portfolio. But one of the key parts of the work we do in the portfolio is around child-centred policing. I'm going to share my screen just to forgive me. Okay, so child-centred policing was developed from the 4 pillars of procedural justice, those of voice, trustworthiness, fairness and respect, and the views expressed by children based on the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child. And I know Carla has mentioned procedural justice in her presentation. From these principles, the portfolio developed a child-centred policing best practice framework, which covers policing behaviours and activities arranged in 5 themes. Those themes are there on the on the screen, as I say, we are looking to bring that down to 3 themes to try and avoid some compartmentalization and duplication of what is done, to bring more clarity to what we do. The framework in its current form was adopted by all forces in England and Wales through the Chief Constable's Council in July 2021. And in the summer of 2023, we undertook a benchmarking self-assessment against that framework with a revised version at the draft stage. We also recognised there was a need to try and bring some clarity with a child-centred policing definition, which was developed in 2023. I won't go through the definition. It's wordier than I would have liked, but this is quite a complex area of work. So what I will say is that one of the key points in it is about meeting the needs of children, and I think this is what this is all about. The as Carla went through when breaking down SEND, it's about recognizing the communication needs and responding to what each child needs on an individual basis, not applying broad standardized approaches. So the next slide just talks about what I've said about the strategic themes. Now, the idea is that the revised best practice framework will look something more akin to a charter, with which would then inform more targeted indicators in a yearly self-assessment tool to allow for developing practice. And that's where I see this report really helping to inform what we put into that charter document, and perhaps through the workshop you've mentioned, we'll look at ways we can be more specific with the indicators which we send out to forces. So yeah, once again, thank you for the opportunity to speak, and we will look forward to working with your team to see how we can develop this best practice framework / child-centred policing charter going forward. And thanks again.
Thanks very much, Paul. Really interesting to hear your insight on child-centred policing. We're going to go into the next part of today's session, which is the Q&A with all the speakers. So I know Kate's having some technical issues with Teams, but can I ask all the speakers if they can to switch on their cameras? Lovely. And I will invite everybody attending today to start kind of submitting their questions. And while you're having a think, I'm going to make a start and use Chair's prerogative to ask the speakers a question each. So my first question is for Carla and Bami. In this research, you've looked at how support for SEND is implemented across a range of youth justice service areas, and obviously you found some very different practice. What do you both think are the most important features of areas that have effective practice? And that's a question for both of you. Maybe Bami, do you want to go first?
Yeah, sure, I can go first. Thanks, Sal. I think it's really been highlighted by all of the speakers today, the kind of need for training, for better kind of like partnership working as well. I think the areas that work really well, you can really see that that's evident. So even just like what Carla said, that kind of having that assumption that due to the prevalence of SEND in the youth justice system, that most children that you're going to have contact with are likely to have some sort of SEND. And so kind of being aware of that from point of arrest even to like interview. So if that means kind of if you're arresting a child, being really clear when you when the officer says the caution, kind of making sure the child understands that, kind of adapting the way that they interview, or even doing, I know a lot of police forces are moving away from having children in custody, moving towards voluntary interviews, just so that there's more time kind of taken to kind of find out what the child's needs are, speak to the parents. Obviously, we know that that's not always practical or appropriate depending on the offence. But if we're thinking about diversion and the type of offences that would qualify for diversion, you know, they can be done a bit more in slow time. So taking that time to kind of understand the child's needs and not make the assumption that they have the same level of understanding or communication as, you know, an adult or a child who doesn't have SEND. And then also I think with areas, youth justice services that are, you know, have integrated or like co-located services with early help, so they have that kind of relationship where that information sharing is really, really done well. But then also having speech and language therapists, which I know is often down to resourcing and funding, so not every area can have it, but the areas that do kind of have either, you know, a speech and language therapist in their team or a seconded speech and language therapist, it really makes all the difference for those assessments earlier on, and even just that kind of shared learning that you're able to have when you work closely with someone with that specialism. And also, yeah, like Carla kind of pointed out, the interventions and being really adaptable with the type of interventions you have with children. Kind of when we did the interviews with the sites, I noted that a lot of the workers would talk about how, you know, this child, you know, isn't going to speak if we just sit down and face each other. I need to make sure that they're active, you know, if they're playing table tennis or like walking around the park or something, making sure that they're doing something that helps the child open up a bit more. And we know with diversion, you know, it's a bit shorter, the amount of time you work with the child. And so kind of building that rapport and that relationship can be a bit more difficult because you don't have as much time, but then really investing in making sure that the child is kind of heard, and that, you know, you speak with the parents to find out what really works with them in terms of their communication style. That all kind of has a really big impact. So those are some of the things that I've seen with the practice that we've kind of interacted with.
Thank you, Bami. Carla, did you have anything to add?
Yeah, so just to add on to that, Bami's covered a lot there of kind of what best practice looks like. But I think just on the point about speech and language therapists in particular, or just sort of communication experts co-located on team, one thing we found as well was not only was this extremely helpful sort of for early diagnosis and kind of by individual cases, but it was also extremely helpful for regular kind of updated training for YJS staff. So there was a bit of a noticeable difference between staff that kind of had that conversation with the specialist that was already on their team and regular training to update their understandings of children coming in with different needs, but also kind of provided some sort of forum for sharing practice around specific interventions. Because one thing that did come out around good practice was that sort of very positive practice around tailoring of interventions could often be down to individual diversion workers and their passions and their backgrounds, which is why kind of that sharing and that space for sharing was so important. But this could sometimes come through in just holding regular trainings with the team to share best practice around the flexible approach and what would work best for children.
Thanks, Carla. And Paul, did you want to make a observation?
Yes, I'd like to make an observation, just seconding really the benefit of having those speech and language therapists co-located. From my own previous experience, I worked with a speech and language therapist on an alternative wording to the caution for a young person, to which really assisted the communication and that child's understanding of the disposal that was being given. So it's just thought it would be useful to point out as a practical example of the difference that can make.
Thanks very much, Paul. I'm just going to move on to the next question. And Paul, this one will be for you. It's obviously really interesting to hear about the new vision for child-centred policing. And this question touches on, you know, a point that Glenn really raises as well, and then the chat, which is around given the points made in the report about how police attitudes and culture act as barriers to implementing existing guidance, do you have any thoughts about how either the NPCC or, you know, the 43 police forces across England and Wales can ensure that these cultural barriers, they don't actually undermine this new approach?
Quite a challenging question, Sal, I have to say, to speak on behalf of policing. What I would say is that we do recognise that child, and sort of following on from what Glenn's put in the the chat bar that child-centred policing means different things to different people, which is why we developed a definition, but also we realised that child-centred policing has to have an application at an individual level, a force level, and then at a national level. So this is why I think some of the recommendations around training are very pertinent and something we're working with the College of Policing on. But also to sort of reassure Glenn that child-centred policing is not merely theoretical. That the best practice framework is designed for forces to guide their activity in all regards to the policing of children and young people. That we have asked that the taking part in the, or rather conducting the self-assessment is included in the HMICFRS inspections to give it some teeth, as it were. And so to reassure all those on the call, this is not something which is merely phraseology. It's going to have a practical application, and our experience of the self-assessment we did in the summer was actually really promising, and we got a lot of interaction and data back from that, and we feel that that will improve year on year as we refine what we do, and we hope to see that embedded at all levels of policing.
Thank you, Paul. And it's also quite reassuring to hear that point about including in the HMICFRS's potential inspection regime, because we all know what gets measured gets done, so really good. And thank you for tackling that question. Kate, this question's for you. One of the things called for in the report is greater sharing of good practice around children with SEND. Are there any particular examples of good practice which you think are worth considering?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's a youth justice service. The name's going to lost me now, but has actually done a project where they've got speech and language therapists in court. So they are, screening them at that point, and that is supporting cases being sent back for consideration of diversion. You may have got through court because they haven't provided admission, or they've done a no comment interview. I think for me, there is lots of good practice out there, and I'm sure that was kind of picked up through your research. But I think our role is really kind of strengthening how we're identifying and sharing that practice more broadly. So absolutely aligning resources to diversion schemes is critical. So having the ability to screen children at that point and understand their needs fully, and to divert them appropriately is absolutely essential. We've seen some really good practice where there is a speech and language therapist that screens all children that go through to the joint decision making panel, and often pick up unmet needs, unidentified needs, children who've been out of school for a period of time. We know that children may be excluded from school as a result of their behaviour, when they come into contact with the youth justice system and then screening is undertaken, we actually identify they've got some significant needs that haven't been picked up earlier in the system. There are some other good practice happening where youth justice services are working with their education colleagues, and where children are at risk of exclusion, they're doing that kind of screening and assessment and intervention at that point. So for me, it really is the good practice that we see is really about a commitment to resourcing from partners in a particular area, recognising the importance of early identification and screening, and a commitment to diversion as well. And actually, I think Bami touched on it, but doing everything in slower time to allow for a real kind of assessment and understanding of what that particular child's needs are, and, you know, determining the most appropriate outcome for that child. But just to do another plug, you know, part of our oversight framework, and we do this already, but it is really an area we're developing quite significantly at the moment in terms of getting those practice examples. We do have some currently on a resource hub, but as I said, that's going to be revamped really soon. It's nearly ready to go, and I think it's going to make it much more accessible for people to be able to access those practice examples.
Thanks very much, Kate. Paul, did you want to come in?
Yeah, sorry to pitch in again. Kate's actually prompted me there talking about the practice examples, because this is something which we're also developing through the College of Policing's practice bank. And we're actively looking for those examples, particularly examples where we're working in partnership, or even we can include standalone partner examples of good work in this field where it affects policing, and that's shared across all 43 forces in England and Wales. So I think that's a positive step forward in being able to share what good practice looks like.
Thanks for that, Paul. That's really encouraging to hear. I'm going to go to couple of questions that we've got in the Q&A. Question from Emma Snell. Emma asks, does the panel have views on the particular impact on young women and girls and racialised children, given the reduced likelihood of having a formal diagnosis and the additional disadvantages faced by these groups in the criminal justice system and at large? That's quite a question. I'm going to put it to the panel to see if anybody wants to try and respond. Kate, you've got your hands up.
I'll give it a go, and then hopefully my colleagues can chip in. I mean, absolutely, we know that there are a number of different groups of children that are overrepresented in the justice system. You know, there is lots of evidence that tells us that children from ethnic minorities are overrepresented at every stage in the justice system, although underrepresented in the diversion cohort is kind of what we're seeing. So they're more likely to receive a formal outcome, for example. We're seeing an increase in girls offending more recently, but it really comes back to these themes of we need to be looking at each individual child and understanding what that child's needs are and making sure that interventions are tailored to those children. I mean, in terms of the disproportionality issue, obviously in terms of diversion, you know, the use of outcome 22, for example, you know, it's obviously a forced decision, a local decision whether that is used, but you know, I think that is particularly relevant to children from all disadvantaged groups, including children with SEND, because it can be used to divert children who don't make an admission. And we know that children often don't make an admission for lots of reasons, or go no comment for lots of reasons, and it's particularly pertinent for children with SEND. So there are some real practical things that can be done locally to really kind of address some of those key issues. And Emma's going to come in now, I'm sure, and say more, but that was just some initial thoughts from me.
Thanks very much, Kate. Bami, did you want to come in?
Yeah, and just echoing what Kate said, I think obviously we know that there's a high disproportionate number of Black and minoritized children in the criminal justice system, youth justice system, and part of that is, you know, down to police and practice at times, because we do know that, you know, if there's an over policing of particular communities, they're more likely to be represented in the justice system. So there is a lot to be done around kind of the police and practice before it gets to the point of where a child will be diverted. And just like Kate said, sometimes you'll work with an area and they'll find that the child has, you know, not had access to diversion, not received the community resolution, has gone straight to court, where maybe their white counterparts might not have. So kind of thinking about why that is. And I think there's some areas that are really doing great work in terms of not just having scrutiny panels, but also having like specific thematic panels that kind of scrutinize with its disproportionality, with its gender, and really looking at why these cases have come to where they've come to, and then also sharing that feedback from the scrutiny panels with their teams, because sometimes I think the scrutiny panel outcomes, they're shared as minutes online, but actually it's only going to be people that are particularly interested in that are going to read it. So making an effort to share that with like a wider team and like the force as well can really kind of show that certain outcomes shouldn't be tolerated. This is how. And also I think as well on the youth justice side as well, being able to adequately challenge when you do think that there's been an outcome that shouldn't have happened. So I think in the report it kind of mentioned that there's a bit of it depends on the area you're in and the kind of partnership working that they have and the agreement that they have in terms of how decisions are to challenge. But I think really having that really clear as well is really important. And yeah, there's a lot of intersectionality. We know that there might also be cultural barriers as to why a child might not have an assessment, or their assessment, their diagnosis not be recognised within their family. So also just for police and youth justice services to be more aware of that. And that also comes down to training, cultural competency training as well, is one of the things that some areas are really doing well, and kind of recognising that. And also in terms of the interventions as well that are available, making sure that they're kind of gender informed and gender responsive, and also sensitive to race and ethnicity as well, and taking into account that the child might have a specific diagnosis and you might be able to help them with their the behavior that's led to their offending, but they're still going to go back to that situation that they might be in, where maybe they might be excluded from school, or their home life might not be the best. And so kind of being aware that yes, you can provide an intervention, but what about like holistically, what does the child need and how can you support them? But yeah, I'll pass on to Carlos, probably has some good insights as well.
Thanks, Bami. Carla, just bringing you in next.
Yeah, so just to add on to all the points Bami's made, I just wanted to highlight the kind of intersectionality of the kind of presumptions against children from Black and minority ethnic backgrounds, specifically who have SEND, in terms of adultification. So just kind of from other evidence coming out around how adultification affects perceptions of behaviors and perceptions of communication. If you have kind of a child from a Black minoritized ethnic group with SEND as well, presenting behaviors that you often see with children with SEND that are perceived as non-compliant but resulting from SEND, this is kind of even further compounded for children who are at kind of higher risk of adultification. So I think in addressing the barriers that children who have SEND are facing in accessing diversion, it's really important to address that alongside addressing the barriers faced by children from sort of Black or minoritized ethnic groups as well, because those go very much hand in hand, and there's that intersectional disproportionality there as well.
Thank you, Carla. I'm going to try and take another question from the Q&A. This one is from Kate. Sensory integration is an unmet need for many SEND children that's often directly related to their presenting behaviours. Do you think we need sensory integration trained OTs in youth justice teams? What's the panel's thoughts? Does anybody agree with Kate?
Yeah, I mean, definitely that would be ideal. And would definitely be like in an ideal world to have such, especially, but also I think one of the things when I've been speaking to some speech and language therapists as well is that they're also, there's not that many speech and language therapists. So I can also assume there's not that many sensory integration trained occupational therapists. I don't even think I've come across that title. That just might be because I don't really work in the field, but I think it would be great, but also, once again, it'll probably be patchy because it'll depend on the area and what they can fund, what they can resource. So if, an area does have that capacity, they already have, that kind of specialist worker in their local authority and they're able to work within the youth justice service, I definitely agree that that would be great, because yeah, there's definitely a lot around sensory issues, and that probably comes out as well, especially in such a heightened situation as an arrest or attending a police interview, or even taking part in particular interventions. So it would definitely be great to have that kind of assessment before it gets to that stage with with gets to that stage with the police or youth justice service, but just in terms of how that would happen, that would also be down to funding, I guess, and the local authority and local need as well.
Thank you, Bami. I'm going to go to another question. This is from Patricia. I'm not sure you can answer this question, but where does the overall responsibility for preventing children with SEND coming into the youth justice system sit? The number of children we are seeing with undiagnosed needs is astonishing. Often by the time they come to us, they would have already experienced school exclusions, suffered poor mental health, and potentially have been exploited. How can the youth justice system be expected, and in inverted commas, to sort them out? Quite a question. I'm going to put it out to the panel just to see what your thoughts are. It'd be good to get all your kind of thoughts on this one. I'm first going to start with Kate because she's got her hand up.
Yeah, well, I think to start by saying, completely agree with you. And often when children come into contact with the justice system, basically there have been gaps in what's happened previously, whether that's through education, children's services, responses, etc. And it is really unfortunate that children need to come into contact with the criminal justice system in order to get their needs met, and that isn't a situation that we want to be in. But at least by strengthening our use of diversion, we can at least ensure that that child isn't criminalised and facilitate them getting the support that they need. So it's not an ideal situation, but I think that's where the importance of diversion really comes in. In terms of whose responsibility it is, it's everyone's responsibility. It's cross-government. It isn't just youth justice services. It isn't just policing. It is a wide responsibility. We work very closely with our colleagues in MOJ, Youth Justice Policy Unit. We identify themes around this sort of thing and kind of the trends that we're seeing, the complexity of the needs, which is escalated and is considered across government, and that information is shared. So we completely recognise the need to be working upstream, and we recognise that it shouldn't all be the responsibility of youth justice services, and kind of we recognise that, and that is those things are kind of ongoing in terms of trying to find solutions and responses to that. So I'm not sure if I fully answered that question, but that's just my initial thoughts on it.
Thank you, Kate. Paul, did you want to come in and offer what your thoughts were?
Yeah, following on from that, I think my observation would be we can't get too hung up on diagnosis. I think we do need to, and I'm sure I read it in the report, that we need to, where we suspect there may be a communication need, we need to be responding accordingly, because I think we're in danger as a society as a whole of being quick to want to diagnose things, and of course we're not all sufficiently trained to do that, but what we can all do is recognize that look on a child's face when they're not understanding what's being said, and we need to make sure that we are doing our best to communicate what we're doing, why we're doing that, and include the child in decision making and in thinking about responses to offending or even challenging behaviour, if we're talking about before children are reaching the point of entering the criminal justice system.
Thanks for that, Paul. Carla, did you want to come in?
Yeah, so very important question, I feel, again, and just to kind of echo some of the things said in the report about this, it was really clear that there's so many children coming in with these diagnosed or undiagnosed needs. The YJS was clearly filling such a big gap of support that they hadn't been given before coming in and doing this intervention. And we had several different children kind of say to us, oh, I never wanted the intervention to end, or my practitioner was the first person who told me that this specific diagnosis could be a good thing or a superpower to me, and framing it in a more positive way. And it was clear that for so many children, this support was only coming in at a time where it shouldn't be coming in, and where they were only being picked up once they came into contact with the justice system, which was in a way positive that they were getting this support at this point. But again, it shouldn't be on the youth justice system to provide that level of support. It should come in before, and it should prevent them from coming into contact with the system in the first place. So again, just to echo Kate, I think it definitely needs to be cross-governmental, and more needs to be done in education before children ever reach the point of having to receive that support from a diversion intervention.
Thank you, Carla. And just before I close this one off, Bami, did you want to add anything to that? Because it was quite a broad, wide-ranging question.
I think everyone really covered it well, but yeah, I would echo, and I would even go in and say health as well definitely are an important partner in this as well. And I think sometimes, and also social care, and I think sometimes there is a lot of onus on the youth justice system to cover a lot, but actually sometimes we are actually drawing children into the justice system to receive help that actually the support should have been offered much earlier. And as a result, it kind of ends up like a bit of like a net widening situation, because we want to help these children, because sometimes you even see prevention within the youth justice system providing this sort of help when actually the child has not offended just yet. And it is because there is an unmet need, but also we don't want to be doing that to children who should be receiving support elsewhere. So I definitely think there does need to be a better response across all the government bodies.
Thank you, Bami. Going to next question, which is about, and Paul, you responded, but I'll just bring it into the conversation here. This is about, from Grace, spotlighting SEND for children and young people in criminal justice at local criminal justice boards and at youth justice equivalents would also be an ideal way to scrutinise criminal justice agency approaches here. And Paul, you've offered a thought here. You thought it was a really good suggestion. Do you want to maybe expand on that?
Yeah, I mean, I do think that's an excellent suggestion. You know, as I've said in the response, it's not that difficult to do. I mean, there are separate conversations about the makeup of those youth scrutiny panels and how often they're held and getting that consistency. But yeah, I see no reason why SEND couldn't be. I think it was mentioned earlier about thematic areas to look at within scrutiny processes, and clearly SEND is something that it would be one of those categories. So yeah, that's something we can take forward, you know, straight off the bat.
Thanks very much, Paul. And just kind of checking with the panel, did anybody else in the panel have any kind of thoughts or additions to what Paul has said? No? Okay, thanks very much. Just checking the questions. I don't think we've got anything else. I've got a question. Clearly, I'm not a practitioner and I don't have a background in this area, but I've read the report before having the privilege to chair this conference and this session today. And the question here is, how is youth diversion working for children with special educational needs and disabilities? And arguably it isn't. It isn't. And when you look at the size and scale of the problem, this to me feels very much like a hidden issue. You know, what is the panel's thoughts? Because obviously you are the experts. How do you raise the profile of this issue so that something which is clearly a problem, and the size and scale of the problem the report really highlights? What is your thoughts in respect of the particular sections of the system that you sit in? How can we collectively raise this profile so that people, or more people systemically, can engage with the solutions? And I know that's not an easy question, but it really struck me when I read it. You know, just the size and scale of the disproportionality of SEND children in the system, and then when you get to the diversion issue. So it's not meant to be a hospital pass, it's meant to be a genuine question. How do we collectively do that? And I'll just kind of throw it open to the panel. Paul, thank you for kicking it off.
I think it's perhaps easier for someone like myself who's, I mean, I have a son with ASD. I have, you know, as I say, worked in these schools roles. I can think of many examples, but it's trying to bring those examples to life for people so that they can see that this is real, particularly the concept of intersectional disadvantage. And of course it can be compounded actually through, you know, as you go through a childhood, those disadvantages can have a, you know, a compounded cumulative effect. So I think it might be useful to have some, certainly within policing, some content created to show how that works. I mean, there's been some good training and work done around adverse childhood experiences, which showed that particular thing very well. But I think for those that are not used to dealing with children and young people, I think we need, or it would be useful to have some short stories to show how the lived experience of children and young people, about how this happens in, or how this looks in practice, and how intervention at various stages, but thinking for us within policing, how those interactions when children are in contact with policing, how we can do those better, and certainly with that, always with that focus on prevention and diversion rather than escalation through the CJS.
Thank you, Paul. And it's a really interesting reflection. Basically, you're talking about humanizing, aren't you? Through storytelling. It's something I kind of, in my former professional life, did in systemically in Stop and Search. Different issue, but, you know, humanizing instead of a thing to be dealt with can be quite powerful. So thank you for that reflection. Bami.
And yeah, just to echo what Paul said, I think at the centre we're really in a privileged position because we get to work with so many different areas, different forces and different youth justice services, and we get to see that there's actually a lot of great practice. It's all quite like local great practice. And while we kind of wait for that, I guess, more government, you know, national standardized response, we can see that there's really, really great practice going on, but often these areas are working in silo and not really sharing the great work that they're doing. And this is why we do things like have this research report, and also we're going to have an in-person practitioner workshop where we're able to kind of discuss what areas are doing and also kind of share, you know, best practice, so that we're able to actually see that a lot of the things that we know is right to do, and we have a gut feeling as practitioners that it's right to do, sometimes you just need another person to kind of confirm it, or you need the evidence to kind of back up what you already know to be true. And the reason why we even, you know, came across this topic within diversion was that practitioners were pointing out to us that they were seeing, you know, over and over again, a lot of children with diagnosed or undiagnosed needs, and they were, you know, highly overrepresented. And that's also how we, you know, worked in racial disproportionality. And I'm sure there's other areas that children are specific cohorts of children are overrepresented in the justice system, like looked after children, children with excluded children. We know that these are all really big areas of disproportionality, and these are all things that practitioners flag to us. And so being able to evidence that this is an issue, but also kind of sharing best practice. And I would say as well that there have been some positive moves. We know that the Asset Plus has been kind of adapted for youth justice services to kind of think about diversion. So it's not as an intensive kind of assessment tool, but it's also kind of takes into account SEND as well. And we know that there's, you know, now that, you know, a lot of areas are using Outcome 22, hopefully you'll be able to kind of collect that data on, you know, what areas are giving interventions for specific outcomes. But obviously there needs to be more done as well in terms of data collection, and that will obviously come from, I guess, government bodies to kind of push that. But we do think there needs to be more in terms of data collection, so we can actually know the cohort of children that, you know, have SEND, diagnosed or undiagnosed, and what works for them, and how we can make sure that they're not coming into the system again, and also that they're not reoffending. So there's some positives, but I definitely think that more can be done, like you said, Sal. But yeah, I think just being able to share that there is good practice kind of gives a bit more hope to obviously really stark situation.
Thank you very much, Fahmi. Kate.
Yeah, so it's Neurodiversity Celebration Week this week, and I didn't know whether that's purposely why you put this event on this week. I'm going to say it was, but we're doing a lot internally at the YJB, so there we've covered it in our bulletin. There's been a blog written by one of our board members. We've developed a clear position statement around this cohort of children. So I think it does have that profile. I think the messages are getting out there, and we'll kind of continue to do that. I mean, in terms of diversion, there's been a huge amount of work that's gone in to improving diversion across a number of agencies. I've touched on some of it in my presentation, but in terms of developing guidance, clear guidance, I believe that there are some really good guidance documents out there now to really guide diversion practice. And it's now about us kind of making sure that they're being used and they're being operationalized and people understand them. So there'll be some work about that. There's been a huge amount of work around data. So the new key performance indicators for youth justice services looks much more closely at needs, and also looks at diversion outcomes. The Youth Justice Board now collect diversion data as part of their routine data collection from youth justice services, and that reporting is mandatory. And all of this will help us to develop a much clearer and stronger picture nationally about what diversion looks like, what those interventions look like. I've also touched on the prevention and diversion tool, which Bami's just mentioned. Having that centralized tool for people assessment tool for people to complete will mean that we are able to extract information from those assessments to really look at what are the needs of this cohort of children. So there are lots of things happening, still more to do, but there's been a huge amount of work by a huge number of organisations to kind of really move this forward. And I think, I'm quite optimistic about the future.
Thank you, Kate. And as we come to the end, Carla, if can I ask you in a couple of minutes just to share your thoughts, please?
Yes, I was just going to echo a few of the things said, but just on Kate's point, I was going to mention as well is Neurodiversity Visibility Week, which is definitely by no coincidence the week that this event was put on. But I think part of this kind of lies in the wider societal kind of understanding and sharing of information around SEND and around the effective SEND, the kind of behaviors that can present in terms of communication, again, as being one of the big barriers for which children are sort of disproportionately facing barriers in accessing diversion. And I think, yes, just to echo the point around diversion data coming out, the previous lack of data around demographics of children being diverted and not diverted, kind of filling that gap and being able to have a clearer sense of the disproportionality between the number of children with SEND being diverted and going on to have more formal outcomes, as well as, again, just reiterating the more human points of evidence and the sharing of stories as well as strategies, I think is really just going to be the key to make sure that SEND is really centered in any discussion around youth justice, because it's difficult for that not to be, and to exclude that as kind of such a central part of the conversation.
I failed with the mute button once. I promised myself I wouldn't do that once, but I was just going to say thank you, Carla, for sharing those thoughts. So you started the conversation, quite fitting you end it. So I'm just going to offer some closing thoughts. I think this is the size and scale of the challenge is significant, but we've heard quite an optimistic note to end the conversation with, of all the different strands of work going on in this area. And I think what I'm struck by is, you've got the Centre of Justice Innovation who've done this work, but we've got, colleagues from the Youth Justice Board present today. We've got a colleague from policing present today. We've got lots of people online today from different parts of the sector, but there's clearly a strong commitment I've heard in this conversation today to work on these issues together. There's a common purpose here. You know, there's a really strong common purpose. And I think when you have common purpose, sometimes even wicked problems, you can nibble away at them. You can nibble away and you can make progress. And I think that is what I've heard come across really strongly today. So can I just, Bami's put there in the chat about the in-person practitioner workshop. So please, everybody on the call, just to have a look at that. If you need any more information, please contact the team at the Centre of Justice Innovation. We'll happily provide you the details on that. And in closing, I'd like to thank everybody that's contributed today, everybody in the conversation through the Q&A, but can I thank Paul, can I thank Kate, can I thank Carla, and can I thank Bami for your really thoughtful contributions. I've learned, and I'm actually leaving this meeting a bit more hopeful than I started, which is always a good place to be, isn't it? It's always a good place to be. So thank you very much, everybody. And I wish you a very excellent rest of the week. Thank you.
Thank you.